Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Tony Piccolo on the history of the Labor Party and the trade unions in Gawler.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for the invitation to address members of the Gawler history team and the people of Gawler tonight. And I do recall when you did ask me about 18 months ago to do it, and I said, well, perhaps there's an election in between, whether you still want me after the election. So, but fortunately from my point of view, I'm still here. I'd just like to acknowledge our Mayor, the councillors, the candidates who are here tonight, and ladies and gentlemen. What I've done tonight in terms of the talk, I'll do a couple of minutes just preliminary about the Labor Party and the trade union for our state, or as a colony as it was back in the 1800s. I think it's important to provide some context, then I'll talk about the history of the party and also the trade union movement in Gawler. The United Labour Party has its origins in the trade union movement. Trade union movement of the 1880s, and I've got a few photographs. And the reason I put this photograph up here tonight, that's the first actually full Labor government in South Australia, and if I'm correct, it might be the first majority Labor government in Australia. There were a number of coalition governments which were headed by Labor premiers, but this one here I think might have been the first whole Labor government in Australia back in 1910. The union movement at that time didn't really enter the political arena until the 1890s. The United Trades and Labour Council was formed on the 31st of January 1884 with the aim of uniting more closely the various trade societies and influence on the colony. You have to remember the union movement started actually as basically to look after people in trades, you know, whether they were bricklayers or what they were called in those days, all the people with the trades essentially, to look after those people in the various trades. There were a number of abortive attempts that were made in the 1870s to give working men direct political representation, and I say working men, that was the language of the day. We could use a different language today, direct political representation, but they floundered as they did not see themselves as needing a specific political voice. And you have to remember that the trade union movement and the Labor Party in Australia didn't have the influence of the union movement that we had in Europe, and also the influences of Marxism, communism, etc. That didn't come to much later in Australia. So that in those days, the working class people accepted there'd be working class people and there'd be a capitalist class, and that was it. And people would actually generally accept that the employer would do the right thing by the employees. And so therefore, they didn't really see a group or an organisation looking after particularly working class interests. But that was to change. In November 1886, the United Trades and Labour Council decided to raise necessary funds to support working class representation in Parliament. Prior to the 1887 election, the United Trades and Labour Council supported independent candidates who supported the United Trades and Labour Council's platform. And only one of those candidates in those years was actually affiliated to the trade union movement. The rest were people who generally, what you might call today progressives or liberal-minded people who had a reasonable values and attitude towards working people, and they got supported by the trade union movement as independents. Two events in the colony's history provided for the impetus for the creation of a separate political wing of the trade union movement. In 1890, payments for MPs were made a permanent feature, so that for the first time actually MPs got paid. And people would think, well, what's the big deal? Well, you can imagine if you had to look after yourself and also to be an MP, it made it very difficult for people who were not on a separate income to actually become MPs. And they were excluded from the process. In the same year, there was a major maritime strike, with the unions in South Australia gone on strike in support of their colleagues in the eastern states. While the strike failed, with the exception of some minor victories in Port Pirie, it highlighted the need for the United Trades and Labour Council to have capacity to exert greater influence in the political and parliamentary process in the colony of South Australia. So on the 12th of December 1890, the United Trades and Labour Council decided to seek and support Labor candidates who were bound to support the United Trades and Labour Council platform, and formed the United Trades and Labour Council Legislative Council Elections Committee. That committee soon became the Council of the United Labour Party of South Australia. While the date of the formation of the United Labour Party in SA is not exactly known, minutes written by J.A. McPherson, who was both the chair of the election committee and the secretary of the council, made reference to the well-being of the United Labour Party, and those minutes are dated 11th of July 1981. So around that date, the Labour Party, or the United Labour Party, was formed in this state, or in those days in that colony.
1881.
Sorry, 1891. Yeah. So what did I say?
1981.
Oh, sorry. It's been a long day. Between 1898 and 1903, there was a resurgence in the Conservative forces concerned about the advances being made by the United Labour Party in the parliamentary political process. And yet, until that point in time, the non-Labour Party people were just a loose collection of individuals. And after that time, they actually started organising into political parties themselves. So you had, and that's when the block of Labour and non-Labour political parties in this country actually was formulated and exists to today. Okay, coming to Gawler, the early days. In the early days of the town, the trade union movement was very active, organising a significant number of strikes, particularly centred on James Martin's Phoenix foundry. As agriculture began to expand in the 1870s, coupled with the growth of railways, the most vigorous period of industry in Gawler was to follow, until Gawler reached its industrial peak in the 1880s and 1890s. So the one message I'd like to give you tonight is that the history of Gawler, history of trade union and the history of Labour Party is actually quite intertwined, because one actually helped create the other. Foundries such as the Phoenix, the Britannia, Eagle foundries were the primary source of industry for the town. Along with these were also several mills, including the Victoria, Albion, Union Mills and the Fotheram's Brewery and Cordial Factory, all which employed trade union labour. However, none were more crucial to the economy and prosperity than the Gawler's James Martin Phoenix foundry, operating under the name of James Martin & Co. Foundry workers used iron to produce primarily steam engines, but also agricultural and farming implements. The foundry was vital to the town and its people, with James Martin at one stage employing 700 men, and the foundry itself covering no less than 10 hectares. The movement also led to the establishment of the United Labour Party in Gawler, which later became Gawler Sub, the Australian Labour Party in Gawler. One of the most important features facing workers in Gawler in those years following European settlement, was the hours of the working day. Workers in the foundries, particularly those working for James Martin, often took industrial action over this period, pushing for their 9 1/4 hour day to be reduced to a more acceptable 8-hour day. Charles Edson, a local wheelwright and member of the South Australian Political Association of 1859, I'll come back to that, was one of the local men who became particularly involved in this campaign. Edson subsequently held several meetings with James Martin, whom he worked for at the time, and were conducted in paper records in a friendly manner. And one of the things you find at the time, in that there were strikes on, there was quite a respectful relationship, and people actually did sit down around the table and try to negotiate industrial disputes that way. During these meetings, Martin agreed to an 8-hour day system, so long as all other tradesmen in the town agreed, so his firm would not be unfairly disadvantaged. Prior to this meeting, it was evident that how Martin felt regarding the issue, as he attempted to get Edson to withdraw from the campaign by offering him a rise in wages, which Edson did not accept. So he tried to buy him off, in other words. Following these meetings, with the agreement, Edson went to other employees in the town and noted that they had very little difficulty in getting other employees to agree, and the matter was arranged in Gawler without any disturbance or ill feeling. Employers agreed to adopt the new system from September 1, 1873. So next year would be the 100 and whatever date, 175th, thereabouts. Well, anyway, next year is an fairly important, this year was an important date for the 8 hours day in Gawler, just over a month ago. However, these amicable times were not to last, as unfair conditions, particularly at Martin's foundry, caused the workers to take action. There were major strikes. There were several major strikes in Gawler in the early days, largely centred around James Martin Phoenix Foundry, the first lasting from the February 2nd to March 27, 1879, was no exception. Following the successful adoption of the 8-hour day in 1873, James Martin & Co. in 1879 attempted to force their 300 workers back into a 9-hour day. Naturally, this didn't sit well with the workers and subsequently led to a general strike not only in Martin's foundry but also machine manufacturers and wheelwrights throughout Gawler. Upon hearing the strikers' situation in Gawler, the Amalgamated Engineers Association was quick to state its support for the strikers, sending them a letter supporting them and advising they should maintain the 8-hour system, promising to support them if they did so. Soon after, a large meeting was held at the Adelaide Town Hall on March 10, which also announced its support for the strikers. This highlights the strength of the movement as they networked right across Adelaide. The sense of duty and unity was strong amongst the men, along with the principle of standing up for their rights as workers, with 3 men, Curnow, McNamara and Clark, placing a strong emphasis on unity while expressing their desire to stand or fall with the movement. The strike spread to other machine shops in the town until March 27, when the strikers prevailed and the 8-hour system was restored. But the plot does thicken, unfortunately. The second major strike began on February 3rd, ending on May 26, 1896, was again centred at James Martin & Co. This strike, initiated by the engineers, was concerned with a reduction in wages as a result of a profit-sharing scheme that had been established within the company. Through this scheme, it was compulsory for all workers. A portion of the workers' wages were retained by the company and the worker given a number of shares in the firm. Various places of work. Whereas the Amalgamated Society of Engineers fixed the rate of pay for its members at 10 shillings per day, the firm only paid their workers 9 shillings, taking away 1 shilling as payment for the shares in the profit sharing scheme. At a meeting of the workers, it was asked of James Martin whether the workers, were able to sell their shares, to which he replied, yes, if you can get anybody to buy them. So based on that, one of the workers found someone that was willing to purchase his shares in the firm and subsequently sold them. Following this, he received a following letter from the firm. James Martin. Sir, it having come to the knowledge of the directors of James Martin Co. Limited that you disposed of your shares for a nominal amount, they have decided that you set so little value on the shares that in the future the same percentage will be kept back from your wages but will not be credited to you in shares. That is, you will get the same wages but no shares. In other words, you get only 9 shillings but no shares. They regret coming to this resolution, but your action forced upon them a tariff, unfortunate name, a tariff secretary. So the shares and that James Martin was forcibly selling to his workers were essentially worthless, because they weren't there to sell them. It was this fact that triggered the action taken by the strikers, James Martin. James Martin, however, defended his action, arguing that the firm has to compete with outside manufacturers and it will be impossible for them to do so if they were compelled to follow the dictates of the society, that is, the union. They paid a man according to his worth, and some received more than 10 shillings a day. Unlike the previous strike, the strike remained solely within James Martin & Co., as the engineers employed by both May Brothers and Thompson at the Eagle Foundry received their society wages of 10 shillings a day. Soon after the initial strike of the engineers, the Boilermakers approached the Chairman of Directors for James Martin & Co., asking him to abolish the profit-sharing scheme. Not being satisfied with the reply, the Boilermakers collectively made the decision to strike the engineers. During the strike, it was stated that James Martin and the firm would be more willing to concede to the strikers' demands if they acted individually rather than part of a union. That's come back in more recent times where legislation is trying to actually break up unions, or the power of unions, and have individual contracts. Same thing, but 100-something years ago. To which Mr. Syme, the Secretary of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, replied, single-handed will never go near them. They must recognise us as a union. It's so the union members held firm. Despite the opinion of the employees, the strikers were not there simply to cause trouble. They strongly believed in what they were fighting for. This attitude is portrayed by Syme when he states that they would they'd rather be working as they deplore strikes and do all they can to avoid them, which is probably a very true fact. You have to remember in those days is that unions were quite conservative in attitudes. Like they accepted the current economic system, and they accepted that companies would have to do well for them to keep their jobs. Further into the strike, James Martin was still not willing to concede to the strike's demands, and in early March posted a notice on the Foundry which read as follows: applications were received from those men out on strike who were furious to return to work until and during Monday the 9th of March 1896. After that date, none of those who went on strike would be employed. In other words, that if they didn't strike, they'd lose their job. The following week on March 7th, much to the delight of the townspeople, the strike was ended with the unbending attitude of both employers and employees giving way to discussion over a settlement. Backing down, which was, as reported in the Bunyip, mutual and in the highest degree praiseworthy. The strikers agreed to return to work based on the promises made by the directors of the firm, which included raising their wages to 10 shillings a day, 9 shillings for machinists for some reason, if their foreman considered that they were worth their wage. However, after returning to work, some of the men found that the firm was not going to follow through with their promise of putting on a night shift, and therefore it was impossible for some of the men to actually return to work. So they cut in labour. As the Bunyip again reported, this was, in the opinion of the men, a violation of the promises made by J.F. Martin, and the district committee were communicated with and recommended to call out again by men, to call the men out again. That is just what they did, and the strike was resumed on March 16 and continued to May 22nd when the workers prevailed and the profit sharing scheme was abolished. Throughout both these strikes and other strikes in Gawler, the strikers were often commended on the orderly manner in which they conducted their strikes. This becomes a recurrent theme, the Bunyip noting that the conduct of the men on strike has been exemplary and has gained the admiration of all classes of the people within the town. During this time of significant industrial action, unions became more involved in the town as workers began to unite, and these two major examples of industrial action clearly illustrated the highly organised and active trade union movement that was developing in the town. One of the unions was the Agricultural Implement and Iron Workers Association. The Australian Agricultural Implement and Machinery and Iron Workers Association was established in Gawler on the 20th of May of 1907. On that date, a meeting was convened in the Institute by Mr. F. Ward, then the Secretary of the Adelaide branch. A large number of workmen were addressed by Mr. R. Blundell, who we'll find out later was a Member of Parliament, and was actually here for the first meeting of the Labor Party a year later. The MP and Mr. F. Ward, a motion was put to the meeting and then Mr. carried and the branch was formed. The following gentlemen were elected the first officers of the association. President H. Freet, Vice Presidents were A. Cush, R. Locke, Secretary Mr. F. T. Twells, Treasurer H. W. Thompson, Trustees were Mr. Robert Matthews and G. Cullen. At this meeting, also two delegates were appointed to meet the employees in Adelaide in conference to regard the fair and reasonable wage, which was a conference held at the time in Adelaide. No satisfactory result was achieved at that conference for improvement in wages, and the case was heard by Mr. Justice O'Connor at the time, and which was part of the National Industrial Relations Scheme, because 1907 we actually were by then a federation, and the Industrial Relations, or then Industrial Relations Commission was established, and an award was made in favour of the workers to increase the wages. In January 1908, the South Australian branches became federated Victoria and registered under the Commonwealth Conciliation and Arbitration Act. The association was then known as the Federated Agricultural Implement and Machinery and Iron Workers Association of Australia. And the objects of the association were to uphold the rights of labour, to promote actually industrial peace and efficiency, to extend the federation throughout the Commonwealth by branches or otherwise, to establish funds to establish and carry on the Labour Bureau and such other objects which may be decided upon in the branch or executive which shall be necessary to support workers in the town. Also, there was a Gawler branch of the Moulders Union. This branch was founded by the late Honourable Dave D. Jelly, MLC, and others on September 17, 1906, with a membership of 37. He had a dispute fund, an accident fund, and a funeral fund. It is interesting to note, one of the things which the unions did in those days, they would actually had set up a lot of benevolent funds. They actually were very mindful of supporting their workers, just not in industrial issues, but supporting their workers and also supporting families. And that was, in some ways, in the some early cooperative models, in the sense that they actually provided services for their membership way beyond just as employees. And they took that responsibility quite strongly. Those sort of issues then they became taken over by the state as governments changed over time. In addition to manufacturing, another major industry and employee in the sector was retail. And we have the Gawler Shop Assistants Association. E.H. Coombe mentions in his book, The History of Gawler, and he cites minutes, where he cites minutes of the Shop Assistants Association dating back to their formation. It reports the meetings of the association from December 5, 1864 to April 13, 1886, and it, according to him, contains valuable history concerning the evolution of the retail shop system in Gawler. It was in 1863, said the late Otto Worsted, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, who was the first secretary of the association, and he used to work for Mr. Geo Blix, and he was an assistant in one of the stores, and he said at the time, no fixed holidays, nor 6 o'clock shutting up in the evenings, but kept open until 7 o'clock. Mr. Waters, who was at Jas Ferguson's, 2 Loveridges and himself, and they got together in the Gawler Arms Hotel, as unions often did, and drew up a memorial to the employers to grant their request to set forth which assistants got it in Adelaide. And you have to remember, in those days, there wasn't a uniform award. Basically, awards were negotiated a bit like we had to some extent effectively enterprise bargaining in the early days. And so employees locally had to negotiate some conditions for themselves. He's quoted as saying that they didn't find it too much trouble to persuade the employers to see the same amount of business could be done. And he recollects that actually, in fact, on Saturday nights, they used to work until 12 o'clock at night. The preliminary meeting was for the information of the association was held at the Old Spot Hotel on December 5, 1864, and Mr. Walter was elected chairman, and so they achieved better conditions. Now, that was, if you like, a quick crazy of the trade union movements and the trade unions in Gawler. On the political side, and one of the difficulties is actually, because they're intertwined, is trying to actually chart their history in some chronology, so I'll try to do that. Prior to the formation of any political parties in Gawler, the political association was significantly active within the town and in numerous towns throughout South Australia. And in fact, the association was a political lobby group, but not actually been affiliated to employers or employees. And it was generally comprised of people who were quite liberal in their views and also reflected, if like, the free settler attitude, and because of the since the European settlement was colony, South Australia prided itself, it wasn't a convict state, a convict colony, and they prided themselves, actually led the nation in many reforms, and the political association was one of those. Mind you, as I'll mention in a second, some of the issues weren't so progressive, but in those days seemed to be so. In June 1859, the association came to Gawler. At this meeting, 200 people attended. And the issue they were protesting when the association came was the government's allocation of £20,000 for immigration. Not changes sometimes. From a town with such a strong industrial background, many townspeople expressed their concern over what the impact immigration would have on the labour pool in the area, with many feeling that it would exacerbate the existing oversupply of labour. I'm sure you've heard that discussion more recently. So it was decided at this meeting that free immigration should cease, and those present should support candidates that were opposed to free immigration. One of the other early parties to form was the Liberal and Democratic Union. A branch of the Liberal and Democratic Union was formed on the 14th of November 1906, and the officers present were Mr. W.E. Mounster, the Secretary T. Coombe, committee members E.H. Coombe, and that's important in a moment, I'll explain why. E. Potter, J. Beasley, Tempe and Spoon and Potter were the other committee members. The United Labour Party in Gawler. The Gawler sub-branch of the United Labour Party was formed on the 13th of November in 1908, and the next month the Labour Party celebrates its 110th anniversary in Gawler. During a public meeting held in the Institute Hall in the town, and in fact the centenary meeting of the Labour Party was held 10 years ago in the reading room at the time to mark the occasion. One speaker at the meeting was Mr. Chesson MP, who was an MP, stated that he was surprised that a town like Gawler, with so many workers and such an industrial background, had not had a branch formed before then. Also at the meeting it was reiterated that the party wanted an equal deal for everybody and recognised that there were certain difficulties in bringing about such change and improved conditions for workers, but were optimistic about the future. And there was also a great interest taken in politics by the general public. One local man who became greatly involved in politics was Mr. E.H. Coombe. Well known throughout Gawler, the Gawler and Barossa region for both his local history and political achievements, Coombe became a member of the United Labour Party and was elected to represent the Barossa electorate in 1915. Prior to that, he was actually a member of the Liberal Democratic Union member party, and he split from the Liberal Democratic Union when they actually merged with the Liberal Union, which was a much more conservative party, and defected from them and joined the Labour Party. Coombe has been described as a very liberal-minded man, and it is entirely typical of him that he was one of the few prominent people who spoke out against the persecution of Germans during the war, First World War. And in fact, he spoke out against the internment of people of German background, which occurred in Australia, both in the First World War and the Second World War. In the Second World War, also people of Italian background were interned and kept in camps. Sadly to say that many Germans, people of German background who were born here or who were, in that time, citizens of the Empire, who between both the First World War and the Second World War unblemished lives, but again were interned in World War II. In 1916, a major issue for the United Labour Party became conscription during World War I. The global townspeople were strongly opposed to it, as were the majority of Australians, and two referendums were actually lost on that issue. And regretfully, it was the Labour government at the time who pushed that. Regarding this issue, the United Labour Party locally and the trade unions forged ties to combat any conscription. The early Labour parties concerned themselves primarily with questions of immediate concern to their trade union sponsors, the regulation of labour market and labour conditions and conditions of labour, the beginnings of social welfare legislation, the creation of a political system which would ensure workers were paid their due place polics. 21st of March 1912, the Gawler sub-branch of ALP was formed, and that has remained active ever since, and it was basically the modern form of the United Labour Party, which was formed 4 years earlier. Following the name change, the Gawler sub-branch became involved in several campaigns, including, of course, various elections. Now, to explain the people who actually represent the Gawler area for the Labour Party, or the United Labour Party, you need to get a bit of an understanding of the electoral boundaries. And that the early boundaries were actually were multi-member boundaries, and in early stages, actually, Gawler was part of the Barossa region, and it wasn't until later that single-member boundaries were formed, and that we had, in 1915, E.H. Coombe was first elected as Labor member for the multi-member electorate of the Barossa district, a position he held as a radical liberal in the early. From 1918 to 24, the electorate was represented by Liberal members until A.L. Hopkins was selected on a Labor Party platform. He was joined in the 1927 election by G. Cook, and in 1930, all three members of the Barossa region electorate were Labor affiliated: Cook, Edwards and Hopkins. In 1938, Gawler was included in the single-member electorate, so the multi-member single-member electorates, the district of Gawler, and was represented by Labor MP Mr. L.S. Duncan. He held this position until 1953, when Jack Clark, a primary school teacher, was elected to Parliament. And some people here would know Jack Clark. Jack was a primary school teacher, had a parliamentary career, and lasted from his election in 1953 until 1975.
22 years.
He held it to 1970. 70, that's right. You're quite right, Rick. That's an error in my typing. 1970, when the boundaries changed again, and Gawler then became a part of the light electorate. Sorry.
Yeah, there you go.
1970. Jack was a member of the Standing Committee on Public Works for 12 years and chairman of the Standing Committee for 5 of those 12 years. During his career, he campaigned strongly for sewage for Gawler and promoted upholding the family unit, often been described as a friendly father figure. Jack died in 1984 at age 77, and sadly to say, I actually never got to meet Jack. But on Tuesday, I met his son-in-law, who is in Port Augusta. Well, one of his son-in-laws, I'm not sure we only had one, but one of his son-in-laws. During the 1970s and 1980s, there were several campaigns that Subbunch involved itself with, including town planning issues, improving public transport for the town, as well as uranium mining issues. Till the 1970s, the ALP was a traditional working class party, but that was the change in the period from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, with the influx of a lot of professional people to the town. After this time, the party had an influx of members who were professionally employed, mainly in the education and further education sector, but also other parts of the public sector. Today, Subbunch holds regular meetings and generates debates and discussions by inviting guests to their meetings on a range of topical issues. From 1970 until approximately 2002, the Light electorate, which the Gawler was part of, was considered to be a solid Liberal seat, with Bruce holding the seat for many years, for 23 years or 24 years? 23 and a half, wasn't far wrong. 23 and a half years. Was a safe Liberal seat, a solid seat. That was a change in 2002 when the boundaries changed and became a marginal Labor seat. The party wasn't to win the 2002 seat, but I was able to win the seat in 2006, and I was only the second Labor member for Light in over 60 years. Along with state and federal elections, the Subbunch has also been involved in supporting members. The other person I want to mention is Honourable Seth Creedon, member of the Upper House. He was actually a small shopkeeper. He used to actually have the dry cleaners from memory in the main street, and he was a member of the Upper House from 73 to 85. Unfortunately, since passed away, and he was a member of the Gawler branch, but he was an Upper House member. He lived in Gawler, but not a member for the Gawler area. Members of the party also run for local council, like myself, and Seth Creedon was also mayor of the town, and he was mayor, I think, just after Bruce was mayor. Yeah, that's right. He was mayor for some time, and also went into Parliament. As other members of the party who were supported by the party council elections were Bill Young in the 80s, Doug Harrison, late Doug Harrison, so some members who would know. I went to school with his daughter. Lynette, daughter, that's right. Doug was a councillor for 10 years and also unsuccessfully ran for mayor. And I also ran for mayor in 2002 2000, when, as Brian mentioned a bit earlier. Historically, the Gawler sub-branch is the only sub-branch to never really aligned itself with what people hear about factions in the party, and the Gawler sub-branch has not been one of those branches which has been taken over or driven by factions, and all political views have been, over the time, have been, tolerated, not the right word, have been accommodated in the local branch. I think that's one reason why we survived. There was an attempt by one of the factions in the 80s, late 80s, by what was called the centre-left faction, to take over the branch. And then the right faction tried and failed, and then more recently the left faction tried and failed. So we've had all three factions at some point in time try to take over the branch and not been successful. In terms of the ties with the trade union movement, the party locally has not had strong ties because most of the unions are based now in the city. It's not decentralised, the unions are not decentralised like they used to be late in the 1890s, where they actually had offices in Gawler, branches in Gawler. Those days are gone. So the tight relationship is more with the central party and also the unions. And as I mentioned, the Gawler Labor Party turns 110 on the 13th of November 2008. So that is my potted history of the trade union movement and Australian Labor Party in Gawler since the 1880s. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions if I can.
Questions of Tony?
Thanks, Tony.
Karen.
My question, you mentioned strikes in the 1870s, and then you also mentioned strikes in the 1890s. How many strikes were there? Because that's a 20-year period.
I don't know off the top of my hand how many strikes were there. There were quite, at times, regular but minor strikes. But the two major strikes, which I gave some detail about, the ones which actually almost the whole town went out. Another one that gave dates were in the 18... I'll get those dates for you. But there were 79. So those are the two major ones which were, to some extent, part of a Australia-wide and or statewide campaign for AI's days, okay? But also generally just improving conditions. And also part of the movement was to strengthen unions with a view of actually forming a political wing. And it was no accident that eventually the party was formed in the state.
Got another question.
Yep.
It's been said to me that unionised labour caused the downfall of foundries in Gawler. What's your view on that?
No, I don't agree with that, and certainly nothing I've read. And I would have thought if it was the case, the Bainick would have told us that. And certainly the Bainick doesn't accuse of the union. What happened with the James Martin, for example, the government set up its own train locomotive industries, so they lost all those contracts. If you talk to the May family, when Frederick May left James Martin, he went downhill according to them, and I think that's reasonably well documented actually. A lot of the intellectual capacity in terms of design and stuff was actually owned by the Mays, and Martin was just a really good business person. But so I think it was just changing in times. It's no different today in the state. The decline in manufacturing is part of a global change, no individual event. But it was interesting, certainly it declined, but retail then took over. Yeah. So yeah, I wouldn't agree with that's the case at all. And in fact, the relationship between employers and unions, despite the strikes, weren't hostile. It was just that they organised to get change.
Can you explain what factions are?
In the Labor Party?
Yes.
I'll talk about the Labor Party because the Liberal Party says I don't have them. The factions essentially, basically a party like the Labor Party is a broad church, and I mean that quite sincerely, in the sense that and there are people who come from a broad spectrum of backgrounds, but essentially, and the party has changed over time. To some result, the factions are also a response to the change in membership of the party. So The factions are essentially groupings of people within the party who try to, if you like, increase their influence in the party by having groups which then they bind their members to. So if you're a member of a faction, if you convince your faction to do something, you're not just one vote, it could be 30 votes on the conference floor. You know? So essentially people who group together, more so in the past around economic policy, less so today. And I would have to confess that there is a growing element of some personalities in those factions, but also the lines are diminished in the sense that with the change in the party from a blue-collar party, essentially, to one having increasing white-collar workers, that has changed, and there are people in different factions who vote differently on different issues. And I'll give you an example. If we were having a free vote in Parliament and you're joining on social issues, you know, parties, the party vote changes all over the place, and people from different factions vote differently on certain issues. So certainly, I'm a member, formerly a member of the right faction, and I was a member of the left faction for God knows how many years, 30 years. Next year I'll be a member of the party for 40 years. I joined the party in 1979. Next year in July I'll be a member of the party for 40 years. And of the first 30 I was a member of the left faction. And to some extent, the left faction see themselves as a more progressive wing of the party. I'm not sure what progressive means, but certainly on a number of issues, when we get a free vote, the faction system isn't that strong. However, the left faction does bind its members to vote with the left on all issues. The right doesn't. The right actually gives its members freedom to vote. The only time you're bound to vote for your faction is on procedural motions and party positions. But on policy stuff, the right faction gives its members a lot more flexibility.
I've got another question.
Yes.
Just put your...
It seems that the original force for the Labour Party and the unions was about families, because people didn't want to live in poverty and have starving children, even though you're working 9 hours a day. How much has that changed now, and where is the middle ground and the unity of purpose for the Labour Party to progress?
As I mentioned a bit earlier, one of the things the unions did in the early days, and certainly in the last century, in the 1900s as well, they actually often created funds and supported their members and their families. And they often provided a lot of service support, which progressively over time, and that's been taken over by the state. As the welfare state has increased, that role of unions has diminished. And so the unions have taken on different roles because that's actually taken over by the state.
So the middle ground?
The middle ground,
for unity of purpose, to hold together?
Well, the unity of purpose would, in my view, would be that they still are quite strongly on maintaining workers' rights and workers' conditions. People shouldn't underestimate the downward pressure on rights and workers' conditions from the global economy. You know, you often hear companies saying we're going to go offshore unless things happen, and many companies have gone offshore. And you often hear, well, we're not going to pay, you know, X amount of dollars per hour for work, when we can actually go offshore and pay some Chinese worker next to nothing, or some Bangladeshi worker next to nothing. Now, certainly that is changing slowly. The working conditions in China and India are improving as the middle class increases, and we'll find the next continent is another continent where they shift to. But I think that what they're trying to, the middle ground they're trying to find is that what the unions say is we shouldn't protect labour rights and workers' rights in Australia by diminishing work. What we should be doing globally is improving the life, the quality of life of other workers. I think that's very important in families.
Bruce.
And unions are quite still active in leading quite a bit of reform, and for example, a whole range of leave provisions now have been motivated by the union movement.
Bruce, thank you.
Just in relation to your comment about Les Duncan and Jack Clark, at that particular time, until 1970, this was the seat of Gawler, and Gawler at that stage went down through to Salisbury, and the number of members, or the number of people within the electorate, I'll mention in a minute. The number of seats in 1970 were increased from 37 to 49 over the state, so that the change of boundaries was a much greater involvement than just moving the boundaries for the original 37. At the time that Jack Clark was the member in 1970, he had something about 80,000 electors because of the growth of Elizabeth, Salisbury, Gawler and a whole host of other areas. With the change, he was moved down beyond the Dowkeith Road to become part and parcel of the seat of Elizabeth, with a much lesser number of people. And the seat of Light came into existence in 1970, which included places including parts of Wandree Hill, Roland Flat, up as far as Roland Flat only, but not the rest of the Barossa. It was Greenock, it was Kapunda, it was up through Waterloo, and it also took in Saddleworth. At that stage, Jack moved from nearly 80,000 people to a much lesser number. And the seat of Light, which had been around 4,000, 4,500 people at the same time as he had nearly 80,000, finished up at approximately 6,000. So the seat of Light was about 6,000. It made quite a bit of difference to the configuration of the Parliament, with 49 people compared with what it had been. It also meant that a number of seats changed their name, and for example he became Elizabeth at that stage, and this became not Gawler but Light, and there were a number of other changes as well, so there's quite a difference. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
I think in 1970 the seat of Napier was created too at the time. 1970. Yes, that's right. And thanks, Bruce, for those comments. Just interesting to note that the first Parliament back in 1857 had 42 seats. Then it was shrunk, increased to in 1930 to 46 seats. In 1936 it shrunk down to 39 seats, and it was 39 until Bruce mentioned in 1970 47 seats. And what Bruce was saying, and I perhaps won't be as gentle as Bruce, the difference in seats actually was what we call a gerrymander. In South Australia it was called a playmander for obvious reasons, and that where obviously if you're one of the 80,000, your vote doesn't count as much as one of the 6,000. So that was changed, and that was an agreement reached by Dunstan and also Steele Hall, which changed dramatically, and basically one vote, one value as close as possible. That happened in 1970, and then, as Bruce has indicated, changed, and that principle has been adopted essentially since then. And the other major change for Light was in 2002, when it went back south a bit to include the areas of parts of Devon Park, Smithfield Plains and Manapara. 2010, Devon Park was gone. 2014, Smithfield Plains was gone, and Manapara went, etc. Now it's gone back to Manapara.
David Tucker.
Tony.
Yes.
Fascinating
Stand up,
about
please. Stand up, please.
Fascinating about the struggle for workers' rights. And working in this foundry, you know, you got a picture. It must have been like being in hell. There were whirling things, there were flames, and God knows what, shimmering bits and pieces going in all directions. How much, Tony, was the Gawler situation one where it might have led in a global scale compared with Mother England, where most of these dudes have come from? Was Gawler sort of ahead of things here for workers' rights? You know, the 8-hour days, that one obvious thing, but the actual conditions they worked in, was this ahead or behind the mother country? Can you tell us?
I don't know that answer. What I do know that the trade union movement in South Australia at the time looked towards Gawler for leadership. In a sense, it was a major manufacturing town, and therefore Gawler was seen as a place where workers could actually help to achieve change right throughout the colony and the state. That much I do know. But you're right, the working conditions are pretty ordinary when you see pictures of, and quite unsafe. Quite unsafe.
Working till midnight with whirling bits of machinery must have been absolutely a nightmare. Arms going off from time to time. Fingers all the time.
Judy.
Not the arms of machinery either.
Tony,
Yes, Judy.
just as an interesting background to me.
Could you come down,
What
please?
went on in Gawler in the times that you talked. There was a lot of inheritance amongst the settlers that came to South Australia from Britain. This is to pick up on what David said, who had been involved with the Chartist movement
Yes.
and a lot of other groups that struggled for workers' rights. And so you had a concentration in a colony where the European settlers, at least, a lot of the working class European settlers had a quite interesting history, which concentrated a lot in places like Gawler.
You're quite right, because as I mentioned a bit earlier, and I talked about the first leading political party, when that was a party, was made up of liberal-minded people, and these people had been from England, and these are the people who actually had come out from England, and they would have been quite active in England, because, as you said, the Chartist movement and the reform of labour laws in England was occurring, and they brought those values out here. And because we were a free settler, they seek to replicate those in South Australia. Less so in the eastern states.
Yes.
Any other questions? Yes, Peter.
Yeah, Tony,
Stand up and so we can hear you, please, Pete.
He's tall enough, I can see him sitting down.
Tony, with regard to the boom years, you know, to about 1920, injured workers, was there any system in place? Did the unions get involved there to see that workers were cared for?
The unions provided funding for families, and actually, they would actually raise money. As I mentioned, they actually stepped in where the state wasn't there, and they actually have often had funds. They had a funeral fund when a worker died to help the family. They had a number of funds, so they actually would help with actually supporting their families until they could actually work again. They actually collected, and they had a very strong view. The unions at the time was that it was their responsibility to look after their own, and that was a very strong view amongst them. I'm not sure, and that's one thing where actually kept the union movement also flourishing in those days.
Alan.
Yeah, something perhaps should be taken into consideration in that period. We had the World War, we had the gold rush, numerous other boom and bust times. This must have had an effect on unions and workers, and whether they made a fortune or whether they went broke.
Sorry, can you just make that last bit again? I didn't quite hear it.
Whether they went bust or made a fortune, because we had the World War when many men went to war, never came back.
Certainly.
We had the gold rush. The only people that made a profit there was the blacksmith and the baker. All those sort of things came in.
The gold, certainly there was movement right across across the nation when either copper was found or gold was found. It was some mining, but by this time the gold rush had been essentially over in Australia in the main thing, and the most greatest impact would have been, as you said, the world wars. People were taken to fight, and that would have been the biggest factor in around that time, around 1912, 1920s, that period.
Bruce, you have a question?
Just following information which might be of interest, that number 5 Bright Street has been the house of 3 Gawler members of Parliament. It first started off when it was built by Bright, way back, who served not only in the lower house but also in the upper house. Les Duncan, who was mentioned by Tony, lived in it until he passed away in 1952, and in 1970 it was my home.
You suggest I should have bought the house earlier?
I'd like to now ask Pat to give a vote of thanks for your excellent address. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you, Tony. And for those who don't know, I used to be a history teacher, and I've decided I'll give Tony 10 out of 10.
And I loved history when I was at school. I loved history when I was at school, and I've known Pat since high school days. You need to come over here, Pat, this way, the camera.
I'm all caught up.
Yeah, you are.
I'll come.
That's
I'll
right.
get you to hold
Sorry about
that,
that.
I'll hold it for you. Okay.
because there's a secret.
Oh, wow.
That's the secret.
Thank you.
I want it there. It's yours now.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
I'd like you to have that.
Thank you.
I think you really earned it with all that research. So thanks again. Oh, can I tell you a funny little thing? It's always amused me. Back around about 1910 in one of those big strikes.
Oh, not about me then, that's okay.
No, you weren't there. Neither, I wasn't even there. But around about 1910 and those big strikes, you forget that people started work at 13 or 14 easily, and so there were all these young people who were out on strike too. But Vinnie's to the rescue, couldn't have those boys running wild. So would you believe Vinnie's organised a cricket match for them.
Anyway, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.